Wow, that was tremendous. And you are probably going to torque off some coaches and have other people applauding you. And so,
Yeah.
what I would like to do is break down some of that into even simpler terms. I thought that was pretty straightforward for those of us that have been coaching a while, and we can see what you're talking about. But you started breaking down some of the terms, but I heard some terms that I don't think other coaches use too much. You were talking about the gather, and you were talking about the apex. Excuse me.
Sure.
The apex could mean at the end of your extension of after your swing, could mean as you pull back your bat. What are you talking about, apex and gather?
Well, the only time I really use apex is when I'm referring to the gather. And basically, the apex of the gather is as you start to gather yourself. Like I said, the gather is a place where you start when you lift your front leg, when you start to get it yourself into your swing. Players, no matter whether you have a toe tap, a big leg kick, or whatever, when you lift that front leg, you start to gather yourself to a place where it's hopefully at a very strong position. Well, the apex of the gather would be at the place where that gather now is not going to be resisting anymore against that firm backside. So right when that stops, that is where the apex of the gather is. And once you reach that apex of the gather and the correct sequence, now is when you start moving forward and you start the pullback.
Okay, but what you were demonstrating here, but in the videos, most of them are about here. What are you talking about? Where should they be if they, or does it vary?
Well, it varies depending on your stride. It depends, a lot of it depends on your stride and your style. But basically, most elite players, when they reach the apex of the gather, as they're starting to hit, they get to the gather, their hands for most elite players will be pretty much right around the shoulder area, the shoulder armpit area, and the hands will be directly over the back foot. That is when most elite players, when they reach the apex of the gather, that's where the hands will stop. Anything beyond that, if it goes beyond that, that's what's called overload. That when you start getting into too much of a load, where you start, again, like I mentioned earlier, with players who do not set up vertically, they start tilting back, and all of a sudden the hands go beyond the back foot, and it creates all kinds of problems further on in the swing.
Okay. What other terms did I hear? I think you had an inner thigh resistance, and then there was some resistance on the back side, and then there's torque. And what are we talking about there?
Basically, what that is when you're setting up, like I bring up in my videos all the time, you just want to have a kind of an instep pressure in your back foot when you set up, and you want to have, in other words, you don't want to allow any weight to ever get outside of your inner leg at all when you're starting to get into the gather, what I just mentioned to you. You don't want anything to ever creep over that outside of the inner leg. Everything you should feel it almost like I tell my students, it's almost like you feel like you have a cast in your back leg, and it's a very subtle move. If you watch elite softball players, what they do is they have a very subtle negative move or a very subtle gather. And the reason why is because they're applying such great inner leg resistance that the body is not allowed to really shift too far back. And that's what you want. You don't want much of a shift going back. You just want to settle right into that back hip socket. And when you settle there, and once you reach that nice settling into that back hip socket, it's kind of a squat into that back hip socket. That is when the hand should be directly over the back foot. And in that stage of the swing, it doesn't matter whether if you start with your hands really high or if you start with your hands really low or here. That really doesn't matter. Again, that's style. But what you will find with elite players, the hands will start to shift. If your hands are low, they'll start to shift to where I mentioned to you, right there by the deltoid area and over the back foot, or if your hands are really high, they'll start shifting down. I mean, that is what you see in elite players, and that's what that's what should occur in an elite swing.
Okay, well, speaking of that, then also, so you were saying that on the inner of the back leg, but you were also talking before we saw the video of there's a kind of an inner pressure on the front leg.
Yes.
That also stayed inside that ankle. So in a sense, you're almost, I guess, inside both ankles.
Yes, exactly.
All right.
Exactly.
And then when you were talking about toe touch, I started thinking about different batters. You've got Tony Bautista that stands almost facing the pitcher when he starts to hit. And then you've got Stan Musial to put his feet almost together. And then you've got Gary Sheffield and Jeff Bagwell that I don't even know how they could even move with as far as they put their legs apart.
Yes.
They somehow all end up, if your theory is correct here, they all end up kind of toe touching and starting the swing about at the same point.
Yes, yes, that's correct. And basically, again, those are all styles. And you watch players like Babe Ruth, for example. He used to bring his leg in quite a bit, and then he'd get into that very long stride. And again, Albert Pujols, same thing with him. If you put them both at toe touch, even though they're going to have a little bit of a difference because of their body types and style, at toe touch, you're going to see, whether it be an elite softball player, elite baseball player, they're going to pretty much be close to 60% of their height. They're going to have a line, for example, if you're looking at the pitcher from their eye going down, it's going to be kind of a slanted look from, for example, if you're a right-handed hitter, it's going to go from your eye, it's going to go down this way, kind of an angle like that. And the reason why that is because as a player starts to get into the resistance and the torque, it creates this kind of the angle that I'm referring to. You see that. I mean, I've analyzed literally hundreds, if not thousands, of elite baseball players and softball players, and the elite players will have almost identical lines, even though their bodies are different. And the absolutes, they will look almost identical to some degree or another. They're going to be very, very similar.
Okay, so if I'm younger, we have probably the range, young parents of young players, travel level elite players. Then we've got high school, college, and maybe even a few pro players watching here. Some of them would just have to tweak a little bit, but if I'm just starting out and I go, okay, what Tony was saying that's right on the money. I want to have my hitter eventually come up, and I don't want to be left behind, like you said. How do I go about? Well, I think you have a video of a player so that you've worked with for 4 years or more, and see the difference. So maybe we get into a little bit of the training aspect. How do I take a person? Maybe describe a couple of things that you could start with, and then we'll watch this video.
Well, the foundation of any swing is the setup, and I always tell my students, whether we in person or whether I'm doing online, I go immediately to the setup. I make sure that the feet, for example, the back foot is square, pointing straight ahead. In other words, a lot of players you see, they open up their feet, what I call duck feet. That creates problems with the back knee getting over the back foot. So if you want to start correctly, I would highly recommend for people to get the setup done correctly. Now, there's other coaches out there who teach a great foundation for a good setup. My videos, for example, if you go on my Maximum Bat Speed YouTube channel, you're going to find a lot of information on the setup. And it's crucial that if a player wants to go to another level, higher level, to continue to grow, they're going to have to get the setup done correctly. And then from there, I would just go from the setup to the gather, and then from there, the forward move with what I mentioned to you earlier. Once a player does that, it really becomes much easier to implement the rest of the swing, which is, of course, it could take hours really getting into it. But basically, a great setup is going to end up giving you the best chance to have an elite swing.